Hello and welcome to another late night talk. My guest this evening is RR Virdi. Hi Ronnie, how you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, it's pissing with rain here, but apart from that, it's good. It's England though, so it's always raining. It's kind of par for the course at this rate. It's kind of how it is. So we're here today to talk about you, but let's go back in the time machine. Let's go back to when you were young and growing up. What kind of stuff was influencing you as a kid? What were you reading? What were you playing? What were you watching? What kind of fed into the kind of early soup of your brain?
Oh wow. The earliest stuff I really remember was this interesting, I guess, dividing line of more contemporary normalized fiction like thrillers and mystery detective because my mother had a huge love for reading, and when she immigrated here, she brought a lot of classic detective novels and stuff that she might have gotten because she's from India and
Mm.
she studied in what's called an English medium school because my maternal grandfather was military there. So she had a really good education, but a lot of literature was very English popular literature, and then anything that made its way over. So a lot of detective crime fiction and novels, and then Star Trek was really big in India. So that's where the science fiction came from. She had like,
Interesting.
I guess at the time, whatever the novelization of some old classic episodes might have been, stuff like that. And that's what I grew up with first until we started going to the public library. And then I was introduced to Star Wars, which became a lot of my early reading because the 90s was like the big boom for when the Star Wars novelizations were coming out, the expanded
Yeah,
universe.
expanded universe and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
So
Yeah.
I actually went back and hunted down the original copies from my library at that time of the paperbacks that I used to borrow of the Han Solo trilogy. Because I grew up with that, the Kevin J. Anderson, like Young Jedi Knights.
Hmm.
I actually read a lot more space fantasy or sci-fi than I did fantasy until I think the end of elementary school when Dresden Files came out. Because at that up until that point, I wasn't actually aware of urban fantasy as a genre. Um,
Yeah.
I knew Neil Gaiman had written Neverwhere, but I hadn't touched it yet. In fact, like he came later in my reading, and then
Mm.
finding Charles de Lint, Dresden was my introduction to, I guess, more the fantastical set in a contemporary setting, and it blew me away. I became addicted to that, and then weirdly found my way from fantasy, from urban fantasy. I started reading Robert Jordan and backwards to Tolkien about middle school to high school. Then after I
Hmm.
got into Dresden, and then TV, the big one that possessed me was honestly Supernatural, the TV show.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah, the boys. Yeah.
Yeah, probably specifically because I had already been introduced to urban fantasy, which then Dresden was blowing up as Buffy had just started, and then Angel. So there was this huge sweep of television that sort of ran with it and codified the genre, at least for
Mm.
younger audiences. And Supernatural seemed to be the larger culmination of that. It was monster of the week, great mythology, very visual and captivating, and it just that's what kind of led me to writing and starting my self-published career with urban fantasy.
I was gonna say, yeah, watched a lot of the same stuff, and I love Dresden. It's one of my favorite series ever. Really, huge fan. And I love Grimm, Supernatural, X-Files, all these kind of
Great
things
shows, yeah,
growing up, and yet somehow I've never gone and written urban fantasy. I don't know why.
yeah.
It's just one of these things that I'm like, you would have thought, given how much I loved it, I would have gone, um, yeah, one of my other favorite series is the Felix Castor novels by Mike Carey.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
So like he did Hellblazer, the comic for DC
yeah.
for years, and then basically had these other ideas, and they were like, no, you can't do that. So he created his own character and did the Castor novels. They're against urban fantasy, but set in the UK, and I loved them as well. They're such good books. I don't know if you've heard of them.
I have heard of them, yeah, actually, because that's the one genre where I try to find everybody, even obscure authors, like finding my way back to, oh, what was it? I can't believe I'm blanking on this now, but like the motorcycle racing with elves
Hmm.
from the 80s or 70s. Who wrote it?
Right.
Like there was this very early wave of, I guess, what you would now call urban fantasy back
Mm.
when the genre was being really pushed in the 80s, and it was a lot more numinous and amorphous. Like it hadn't been called that yet, so
Yeah.
people were just setting stuff like Delint and like here's rural Canada but with monsters today. And I've gone back and tried to find every urban fantasy author I've missed from any era just because I love the genre so much.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's just that endless thing where it's all hidden in plain sight. You don't
Yes,
really,
yes.
and everyone's like, nah, it's just,
No, like you said, Hellblazer was one of my favorites when I could afford the comics. Hellboy,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah,
Neil Gaiman's
BPRD.
Books of Magic. Like
Yep.
I have like multiple versions of the Books of Magic in print. It's one of the few comics I physically bothered to get now because I love that. Same thing, Justice League Dark, which is their urban fantasy specific
Yes.
contingent. Yeah,
Constantine, Zatanna, Swamp Thing, all those ones. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I grew up reading a lot of that stuff as well. So after all of this stuff, when did you first sort of think, you know what? I'm gonna write a novel. I can do that.
So it started actually at age 18, and it was twofold. I've talked about this a few times. I've struggled with depression and suicidal ideation. I had like a really messed up life, and 18, I tried to take that life, and it didn't work. I succeeded and didn't succeed. Survived, and I don't know what happened afterwards. I kind of fell into like I'm just going to use the summer between high school and going to college to figure out my life. And
Right.
a friend and I and me had gotten really upset at a very famous author who killed off a bunch of his main characters at this point, and it wasn't George R. R. Martin, but
Right.
we were like, "That's not how you write a book. Like this guy can't write." After being like a New York Times bestseller for 30 novels and
What
dominating the
does he
90s,
know? What does he
what
know?
does he know, right? So like, we should write a book where none of the main characters die, and it's just awesome and fun. And we started writing it, and from the first page, as my best friend and I are talking this out, I've never been more in love with something in my life, and we shelved it after 12 chapters because it was horrible. The book is quite literally banned by the Geneva Convention for anyone to read because it is torturous. I mean, I was 18, so of course, like I projected myself into the main character. My best friend was like his ally. Megan Fox was a princess in there because Transformers had just come out.
Oh, of course, of course.
Of
Yep,
course,
yep.
yeah, it was terrible. But I genuinely fell in love with the idea of writing, not even necessarily the story, like just sitting there and even typing and typing to that point of creating something that I hoped would entertain me and somebody else just felt really fulfilling. Like I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And then college and everything became that much harder because nothing was emotionally satisfying. I didn't see what was going to get me a job because this was 2008. So the housing crash had just happened in America. The
Right.
college debt ceiling was exploding. Like going to any decent school, I was looking at tuitions and it was like 40,000 for a year or something. And I'm like, I no, like my life will be ruined. And then I was talking to people who got MFAs and like that doesn't mean you're going to be a published writer. It just means you have an MFA. I'm like, well, what do I go study? And I was just like, maybe I'll spend the time just writing every day. I'll just do blue collar jobs because I'm good at those, and I'll keep writing. And I'll
Mm.
just get better and hope it's a craft because I didn't know at that time if it was or wasn't. You know, if it was magical muses or dumb luck or God given inspiration, but I wanted to write. And I just started at 18 every day.
So when did you finish the first novel then? If you gave up on the other one after like 12 chapters, when
I
did you finish one?
finished the first one at 19 and a half, and it was crap. um I wasn't really happy with a novel that I finished until 23, and that was the first one I published, which was Grave Beginnings, one of my urban fantasies.
Right. So you went straight into indie publishing.
Yes.
You didn't think about traditional at that point.
No. This, and I had started Googling like how publishing worked. I knew tangentially what an agent was, and social media was still sort of active. And at the time, 2012, 2013, e-publishing had just started. Like it was obviously viewed in a very negative light, but there were stories of, you know, Amanda Hocking, the first ebook millionaire on Smashwords, which is no longer active. And then
Mm.
I missed the Amazon Gold Rush, but I'd seen enough on social media where it was like urban fantasy seemed to start becoming a harder sell.
Yeah.
Butcher was obviously the big name, Patricia Briggs, Faith Hunter, everyone had already come in mid 2000s and by now was like a juggernaut. And it
Mm.
seemed like it was dying off by 2012. I saw one editor publicly post like, if your last name isn't Butcher, Briggs, Hearn, Kadri, or whatever, this is six, like you're probably not gonna sell an urban fantasy. So when I was finished with mine, it just seemed like there wasn't space. And believing that it was still a craft, I had the, I don't know if it was ever smart, but the notion that, yeah, as long as I can publish and get it out there, I can learn. Like I'll work on the next one and make it better. Maybe some reviews will teach me things. And
Yeah.
but I don't want to sit around for God knows how many years until this might be cool again and not have gotten better. I'll just publish and keep getting better.
Yeah.
And we did, and that kind of is what worked out. I learned a lot, and I took a year off between writing that and book two. I just read more craft books and attended panels to study, wrote book two, and that one did better. It was up for the Dragon Award alongside Jim Butcher that year, N.K. Jemisin, and a
Nice.
few others. And that's what I think actually helped, being completely honest, because when that award was announced, you know, like there's all these tangential magazines that cover them. One of them was The Verge, which, you know, has like millions of viewers. So I'm pretty sure out of dumb curiosity, a lot of readers were like, "Oh, Jim Butcher, we understand." N.K. Jemisin, like, who's this like random person?
Hmm.
And enough filtering through of readers came through that it was actually enough to support like a very modest four-figure monthly income. Like I could live off. It wasn't like nice, but it was survivable if I just wanted to be really lean, bare bones, and continue writing.
Yeah.
And I had lost my job that year anyway, so I was like, okay. And then since then, I've just kind of eked it out until I'm here, which I'm still doing, eking it out. But
So how many urban fantasy novels did you do? And did you see a change in the market? Were people still, as you said, so a few years ago, I'll tell you this, I went to talked to my agent. This was probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I said to her, I've got a great idea for this urban fantasy novel and blah, blah. She's like, I'll stop you there. How much have you written? And I'm like, I've got plans. I haven't written anything. She goes, don't, because at the moment it's not worth doing. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was probably 5 years ago. So I haven't revisited it, but you were obviously starting back then. How has it changed, or has it changed since you've been writing?
I don't think so. In fact, I worry. Like, I still want to write plenty more.
Right.
Um, I worry the genre hasn't come back, indie especially, because for a while there was a boom. 2015, 2016, indie urban fantasy was a huge market. It took
Mm,
about 4 years, I think, for maybe the traditional guys at that time. There was a die off. I think Hearn series might have wrapped up then, and Kadri's might have. So maybe there was this tapering off, and the readers still wanted to find something, and it took them a
mm,
few years. But it was a very short lived boom where I saw some names explode at that time, and I was making a decent living at the time, just again surviving off of indie publishing only. And then within the next year, lit RPG started catching on. That's when it was first
yes.
introduced. It probably come, if I think it had started making some waves around that time, anyways, 15, 16, but it was very niche. Like, I wasn't aware of it until 2017, and then it was just everyone who was writing urban fantasy moved to chase that. Find like the right to market, figuring out like what would work, and they did, and they're very successful, thank God, because they all have bills, they've got like kids and stuff, and they had transitioned already to full time writing.
Mm,
So they were able to find that, and I even tried my hand at lit RPG, and I had a lot of fun. I just wrote one very dark for a little too dark for the genre, which that was my fault. I didn't consider that. Um, but I haven't seen urban fantasy really blow back up because it
mm,
seems like there's always been something else after lit RPG. There was this huge time where if you were big enough in indie, you could kind of like create this wave of momentum of subset genres some might be creating. So there was a period where paranormal romance blew up, out of the fraction of, I guess, urban fantasy to lit RPG taking over. And
yeah.
then there was paranormal romance, which blew up a lot more. And then there was a subset of that where writing middle-aged magical women fantasy. So like, if you're like a house mom as a character, you
Hmm.
also kill monsters on the side, and that served a niche. And then they just kept fractionalizing. There were other like micro genres that just kept blowing up. And now obviously we're at I think right now it's cozy and romantasy,
Mm,
which now are also being published a lot indie, but romantasy and cozy sort of were already an indie thing. I know romantasy was definitely one along with reverse harem, but I don't remember how much cozy there was, but I do know there was some. But
yeah.
it didn't hit what it is now. So coming back, I don't know. I think the only thing that's like a safe bet is, from what I've seen, epic fantasy has never gone away indie. It has always
No.
been like really well supported. Military sci-fi, like that is a really really popular genre in indie. It feels like a safe bet if anyone wants to write in, you happen to love it. It seems like there's definitely readers for there.
Yeah, yeah. And traditionals does seem to kind of follow the trends and catch up later. So we're seeing, cozy, as you said, romantasy now. There's new imprints that were previously dormant have come back, and
Yep.
new deals being signed all the time, and people saying, oh, it'll go away. I'm thinking, I think it'll be for quite a while. I think it's just
Yeah.
so popular in indie and now in traditional space
Yeah.
that I think it'll be a permanent kind of substep for a long time but we'll see. We'll see.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
so when did you look at your current series now? When did that start percolating, and when did you start thinking about
Oh,
writing it?
interestingly enough, I don't know if it's a problem with me mentally, but I really hate being told what to do, and I also hate like the whole following the popular genres. So
Right.
because when I wrote lit RPG originally, I wasn't thinking it was a smart move. I think I should stay with with urban fantasy. But a friend of mine saw like the genre dying for urban fantasy. He's like, dude, think about your finances, be smart. He's like, you played video games all your life, you're a huge gamer, you could write one of these and have fun. I was
Mm.
like, yeah, but like I have a commitment here with urban fantasy. And he's like, you have a commitment to feed yourself. I was like, okay. And he kind of dared me to write one. At that point, it was like, all right, well, if you're going to put me on the spot like that, cool. And I did, but I wasn't necessarily happy at the end of the first two because I felt like I still wanted to write something else.
Right.
And and I was already compromising because the way he advised me to write it was 100% to market. He was like, write it, follow these beats, do
Mm.
this, don't put your own spin on it right now. He's like, and I was like, but I kind of wanted to talk about some really dark themes. It gets into stuff like child labor, an extreme version of China's one child policy. There's a lot of socio-political stuff in it. And he was like, don't do it. And I did it. And it kind of depressed some of the readers because they wanted like an escapist fantasy, which I get.
Yeah.
So my emotional reaction to that was like, all right, well, I want to break from this. How about I go write something just for me?
Yeah.
Like I want to do an extremely lyrical, comparative storytelling, comparative mythology, because that's a personal passion of mine. Just for fun, like I read specific studies about comparative mythology and etymology and storytelling, certain techniques, structures from cultures that we don't talk about, shared gods, and all shared cultural stories and epics that people don't realize might be similar.
Mm.
And I was like, I'll write this for me, and I'm gonna serialize it. I'll make it indie. It'll be on my Patreon. I don't care if anyone wants it. It'll make me happy. And I started writing at the end of 2018 into 2019. That year, a dear friend of mine, Yudhanjaya Wijaratane, who's a Sri Lankan author, and I co-wrote a novelette, and it had placed for the Nebula for in the best novelette category. So we actually went to the Nebula convention, which I think was in LA that year. And I think being in that very small space, because it's very industry heavy, like raised a different light on our profile, which we weren't expecting. We were just there for the awards and like learn, because we'd never done an industry con. Up until then, I'd done the pop culture ones, like your Dragon Cons, New York Comic Con, which
Yeah.
are lacking in industry people and they're more for fans.
Yes.
And it was really weird because agents started approaching us there and talking, and it was a lot of agents, right? It was a very concentrated industry sphere in such a short time, and it was a bit overwhelming. But they all asked what I had going on, and I told them about Tales of Tremaine, and that the first book was 350,000 word projected, what it was going to be like, and they were all like, "Yeah, no, no." Every agent was like, "No, no."
Too big. Let me guess. Too long.
Yeah, yes. The only agent, and this was a really weird, surreal interaction, but was the person who'd be my first agent, Joshua Bilmish. He literally parted a bunch of other agents, like parting the Red Sea, and he was wearing like a bright red suit with like red pants and red shoes. And I'm like, that's not how people dress, but okay. Bold statement. And he came through, and he was the first one to talk to me about it. And I already tried to disabuse him. I was like, "You're not gonna want it," because like 9 other agents said like it's too big. And he's like, "Well, I published Brandon Sanderson." I was like, "Okay." I mean, I guess that's a fair opening move. Like he publishes big.
Mm.
And we talked about it. And then I didn't hear from him forever. And later that year, I just written, I think, up to chapter 10. Um, and I was at another convention with another editor who oversees like tabletop RPGs and board games, and then adapting them also into spin-off like novels. And he had another editor with him at lunch who I wasn't aware at the time was an editor. And we just started talking Wheel of Time and very interesting stuff about what fantasies motivated us, why particularly, and then what I was doing with research structure and stuff. And I let slip that I had this project going on that now at the time Tantor and Audible were interested in. And he goes, "Oh, well, send me a copy of that." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, I'm a Tor editor, and I'd love to look at it because this sounds like a fantasy I've always wanted." And I didn't think much like what happened. It was Tor, and I'm unagented. And I was like, "Sure." Send him a copy, and I just kept working on it on the side, thinking, maybe I should go get a day job because the indie money was starting to dry up. And then a month and a half later, he's like, "Hey, do you have time for a phone call at the beginning of next month? I'm a little booked now, but we need to talk." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Just wait for the phone call." Like, okay. Phone call comes. He's like, "Yes, I showed this to the president of Tor. Everybody loves this sample." He's like, "Are you ready to sell it?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, Audible kind of wanted the." He's like, "No, no, no. Tor's going to buy the first 3 books." And I was like, "Oh." He's like, "Yeah, who's your agent?" I was like, "I don't have one." He was like, "Go find one." And then that was the end of the call. And ironically, I reached back out to Joshua because I hadn't heard from him, and like the etiquette I thought was you can't go talk to another agent until you get like a either yes or no from the last one. So I asked him, and he's like, "Yeah, I didn't look at the book yet at all." I was like, "Oh," and he's like,
Okay.
"Went to go read it and look at it," and he came back. He's like, "I hate stories that start like this and are about taverns." I'm like, "Well, it's not," but he's like, "But yours is different." He's like, "I actually like this," and I was like, "Oh, okay." And he's like, "Yeah, so let's do this." And then we signed the Tor deal, which led to the UK Go Lengths deal a month later. Because I coming from India, I had no idea how this would work anyways, and I didn't
Right.
realize agencies even had partnerships. So I thought like this was done. Like, oh, this is really cool. It's happened. And then there was another call, which was kind of like shocking. They're like, "Yeah, so we talked to our partners in the UK, and there's like these publishers who want it. Who do you want to pick? These are their offers." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I we got through that process, and then it's just been, I guess, fingers to keyboards getting the books out because they're big.
Yeah, it's slightly different for me, and I guess some people don't realize this when we talk about the big publishers and the big five. Some of them are global, and some of them are not. So my
Mhm.
first two trilogies with Orbit. For those who don't know, Orbit have offices in
Yeah, yeah,
UK and the US and a presence in Australasia. So when they say English language worldwide, it just goes everywhere.
yeah.
Whereas, say, Joe Abercrombie's published by Gollancz in the UK, he's actually published by Orbit in the US, I think. So that's that kind of weird
Right, right.
partnership.
Yeah,
And where it's the other way, you had the other way, Tor and over in the UK it was
Yep.
Gollancz.
Yep.
My current books are with Angry Robot, and they're distributing the US by Penguin Random House. So there
Oh,
again, it's like, so they don't have an office over there. It's just Penguin Random House. They just send it out there. So that's kind of, it's all these weird partnerships that until you get into it, you have no idea how it works. It's
yep.
like,
Yep.
oh, okay,
I
that's what
still
that
don't, to
costs
be
me.
honest. I just know what I've gone through, and that's about it.
Well, yeah, yeah. Talking to other authors, I think always helps. Um, so book one comes out, and what are people saying? What's the reaction? What's the response you're getting from fans and other people?
It was wild because like it came out, and I had just actually turned in book two maybe a month before book one came out. So I was like wrapping that one up because I
Mm,
didn't know the whole publishing history of maybe you shouldn't get that next book done just as fast, even though readers would like it, because you don't know what might change or didn't. And thankfully, not much changed in book one. But when that happened, when book one came out, it was kind of overwhelming because we'd gotten the pre-order numbers and from my publisher at least, and they were higher than everyone expected,
mm,
and I didn't know what that meant. And I was just so desperate, like trying to get back to like making a really good living out of this and focusing on, do I start book three now? Um, my editor vanished during that period of time, which is why book two is coming out this year. We're like years off now schedule because I didn't get edits for like a year.
mm.
So I was mostly dealing with so much internal stuff. I didn't get to really celebrate or go through all the like the ups and downs of publishing with like the book. I just remember a lot of the promotion effort. We launched um, in New Orleans actually because a bunch of friends were really sweet enough to host me down there and
Nice.
set me up with my own guerrilla tour. One of them worked at a radio station and major broadcasting, so I had a TV interview that he set up, which was really cool. And then it was like, okay, cool, we got to drive 3 hours out of New Orleans because there's an indie bookstore that wants you to launch your book, and then we're gonna do this and this. And then I got back, and it was Dragon Con. And then I got back, and then it was local bookstores that I was like personally stumping around. And I was so obsessed with like the work side of it, I didn't get to see many of the reactions until blurbs started coming in from authors, which I think
Right.
was the most I got to see, which was honestly probably some of the best stuff for me though, because I think it's really enduring when like what we talked about too, like everything we go through and we know, seeing that other people who are going through the same are still willing to take the time to read your stuff and find what they love about it and share it back and enjoy it. Because like I think it's a special cool thing about the peers that we get in the industry.
Mm.
So I feel like that's one of the only things we can really rely on. Because like we said, trends change, so much is out of our hands. But having friends who like look at this and go like, oh, this is actually really cool. I like this, and here's what I loved. That's what I really got to like absorb and have a lot of fun with.
Yeah, yeah. I don't read my reviews because I think that like way leads to madness, basically.
Oh yeah,
And
everyone
so
warned me about that too. That and there's no correlation either. I found out. Someone told me about how they had amazing reviews for the book and then it never sold, and someone else told me they were lambasted online and the book was a bestseller.
yeah,
So I was like, oh, and they're like, honestly, the only thing you can really count on as much as you possibly can is your royalty reports, and like that's some of the only hard data you get in the industry. And I was like, oh, I'm like, hey, that's good to know, but it's also kind of sad.
yeah, yeah. So if you get reviews from your peers, I think that that's really worthwhile. I think that
Yeah,
that means more to me than reviews from readers. As much as I like, readers saying they're enjoying their book, when they meet me and they tell me that, that's wonderful because I know I've done my job well. But having a,
yeah,
a contemporary who I admire has read the book and gets what you're trying to do and understands it, I think that's priceless. I think that's
yeah,
more rewarding for me. It makes me feel like I've done a good job, I think.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when you were building this series, how much did you plan ahead of time? Like, how big is
Oh,
it going to be? Like,
I'm gonna
where
get
are we
so in
now?
trouble, but I've already said this publicly, so I might as well.
Oh, okay. All right.
Originally it was planned for 10 books. Uh,
Jesus. Right.
yeah, but with some of the cuts to book two, I kind of explained like, hey, there were certain arcs, and because it's tightly written for its size in terms of past and present, there's multiple going on. I have to move these arcs because I've already committed to them. If you go back and reread book one, which means I might have to add 2 books. I don't know how Tor's taken it, but right now we know the series is selling well. It's
Okay.
on track to out earn. My working theory is that historically it used to mean you get to do more books. I don't know anymore, so we'll see. But when I had first started planning it out, I did what is called a spook exercise that I know about, and it's mostly 2 to 3 lines of the situation, your protagonist, what's their objective, and the obstacles they might face, and what's the climax for, in this case, the whole series. And
Right.
then that I could break down per book of what do I need to achieve for this book that will set up book 2 and pay it off, and 3. And then I could structure it almost in arcs. The way growing up with anime, that was a very easy way for me to internalize, like treat like seasons of a TV show or an
Yep.
anime arc. The first 3 are sort of self-concluded, but they promise a larger story, and just keep doing that. And the actual world building I did, because this book is so much about storytelling and comparative storytelling.
Mhm.
There's a lot of meta referential stuff in the structure to actually being structured like other stories, and payoffs, and certain beats and tropes and commentary within that, and then also using structures from other cultures. There's some Kinso Taketsu, which is very popular with Studio Ghibli, or the Japanese style.
Mhm.
There's a lot of South Asian shorter narrative form structures, including chapter 10, where if you delete all the normalized prose, I have rhyming couplets and quatrains. And if you remove the normal prose, those can all stand together completely. And the entire chapter by half becomes an entire epic poem, the way you'd see in a classic story. And that was just to have it there to still narrate enough of the story. So when I was doing the world building, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to actually world build by stories first and create what are the founding myths of this world, and not just have the myth, but then what epics would they have told based on those? Because that's how so much of ours works. So if like you have
Mm.
gods, I still want the story of the Olympian gods having their Titanomachy and all their little encounters and smaller stories, and then their personal beefs and inter-character struggles, just like you have in Mahabharata and Ramayana. You have in the poetic Edda, to translation to the prose Edda, and the Volsung saga, and then the Kalevala, which is the Finnish epic. Everyone has their own epics, and I thought if I could take them and break them up, they would lead to so much extra world building, cultural beliefs, and everything could kind of permeate out of that, because our world is still built like that today. I mean, religion impacts and influences so much. So a lot of my narrative comes from building and operating within the existing confines of whatever all these different cultures I show along my fictional Silk Road believe in, and has distilled up to today with their political systems.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah,
I'm not expecting you to say that about the world building, but that's fair enough. I knew it was a story about stories, but I didn't realize how much, beliefs and mythology goes into it, and layering it up. So have people recognized some of the, not just the tropes, but the mythologies that you're pulling on?
yeah,
People said that reminds me of that from my childhood, or this, that, and the
yes.
other. Or
So one of the ones I can talk about from book 1 is there's
okay.
a section where Ari is performing a story about Radivan, who is titled A Son of Himself, and he was essentially a demigod god born of the god himself, through a virginal birth, which a lot of people, the way I structured it, realize is like the story of Jesus. However, what they don't know is the virginal birth story actually exists in a few other cultures, and the one I was
Mm-hmm.
analoging most, exactly, there's Persian versions of that, there is a
Mm-hmm.
Chinese version, and there's a South Asian one where the sun god, in this case Surya, bequeaths a boon, which is a virginal pregnancy on Kunti, who is a princess. And in her case, out of shame, she gives the child up. She sends him down river in a basket, which is also Moses. And this is in the South Asian epics. And I do a little twist of that where, in this case, the child isn't given up, but it's still a sun god that bequeaths the boon and leads to the virginal birth. And it was still tied in fundamentally to this world that you see through commentary. Multiple cultures have their take of this. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of a son of himself, but how the story goes is different because our world did the same. And they've caught that. And book 2 has another one which analogs both a South Asian deity and one from China, who have a lot of shared similarities, and it follows a particular journey. And then there's a commentary about that. I don't want to give that away. It's kind of obvious, but I want readers to still read it.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of those that go through, as well as actually parts of Ari's life emulate both fiction from our world as well as mythology, that have found to be shared through at least classic stories from British, South Asian, Norse, Persian, Chinese, and Russian. Because I just thought that would be a cool way to tell this. If this secret, not so secret, because posited within the book is that there's always been proto heroes, and
Yeah.
Ari himself is sort of cast as a proto hero in many ways, emulating this, creating his own legend. So it's kind of a commentary of how legends really work, and Ari just gets to do it again himself. And you see other legends pop up around the world that are very similar to his, like a culture heard of it and then co-opted it, and then it was told enough times that maybe theirs is true too, or if is it just a spin-off his, and that's part of the story, do you get to figure out?
Yeah. So it also, the idea, I don't know if you did this, but so in my story, the coward is a guy who's 10 years ago did something great, and now people are using the story of what he did as propaganda in order to
Yeah,
serve as a function. So are you using story potentially that some people are using the history and mythology for their own ends as well? So they're not just the
yes,
heroes, but how to paint other people as villains to push this whatever they want, politics, history,
Oh,
wars in a
absolutely.
certain way.
So that's discussed in book 1 and 2 of how, at least in terms of the church, the god I mentioned, for example, Radivan, his
Mm,
story is seen as heretical because of the idea of why would God need to come back in even like a semi-mortal form to walk again? But there's
mhm.
historically these stories that still exist. Like no one denies that the stories exist, but the church denies that those stories were ever true. And that's part of the discrepancy Ari's trying to figure out of not only what stories are true, but this god created essentially his world's version of angelic knights that he believes can help him one day or try to emulate to defeat these monsters that killed and destroyed his family and kind of become living nightmares to him that no one else believes in. And the idea is, if they believe in some of these stories but not these, but we've heard stories about them, like, are they real? Am I looking in the wrong place? Like, can I find these real people that I need to find? And
Mm,
then it's in book 2, sort of that happens to Ari in a way where some of his stories start getting used as propaganda, not just
mm.
rumor milling, but actual political propaganda. That's a big turn for parts of the major completion arc of book 2, where Ari realizes how a lot of the shit stories that he's told about himself to sort of get a reputation, either for notoriety to protect himself or a teenager's grandiosity, have now start coming back to bite him when other people with more power can spread them for their own purposes.
Yeah. Yeah. The church often plays an important role, organized religion in some capacity, using it for its own ends. Yeah. It's interesting saying about parallels between certain things. So in Persian culture, there's a story about Rustam who has the trials, the
Yep.
many trials. And of course, I didn't realize until years later, paralleled it with the Greek mythology of Heracles or Heracles and all the trials there. And I'm thinking there's a lot of commonality there between, I mean, the actual trials themselves are fundamentally different, but the stories in
Right.
Ferdowsi compared to all the stuff you hear from, Greek mythology I read growing up. So I grew up reading all the Greek and mythology and Roman mythology in the library until I'd gone through it. Then I went to the other kind of books that I could find and other things and found stories and thought
Yep. Yep.
there's some commonalities here for some reason,
That's
like
exactly how it
thousands of
happened to
miles
me.
apart, and you're like,
Yeah.
where's that come from?
Same introduction. It was obviously the Western ones too here. And then when you get older and have access to other cultures, at least in
Mm.
literature, you're like, wait, that's the same. Because one of the ones that did it to me was reading Mahabharata and Ramayana, the Indian epics, and structurally, they have a lot of key points and similarities in characters to the Iliad and Odyssey. In fact, now there's entire papers about it. Certain beats,
Oh.
characters, certain myths of even impenetrability, like Achilles, where in the original myth it wasn't he was impenetrable, it was his armor was. It was a gift from his mother from
Oh.
Hephaestus. And the original myth is he was never shot through the ankle. The British Museum actually has artwork that depicts it. He's shot through the space between his armor, lengthwise,
Ah.
between his impenetrable armor. And then there's a character in Mahabharata that loses his magical impenetrable armor, gives it up, and he's shot in the back, like because now he has a mortal weakness. And then you realize there's an entire myth of impenetrability throughout cultures of someone kills a dragon, bathes in dragon's blood, now impenetrable, but for one spot where a leaf stuck to his back,
Mm-hmm.
he gets stabbed there later, and it just continues. There's thousands of these examples of just hero somehow was impenetrable, but one weak spot killed over and over, and it just started a domino chain for me finding how many different cultures could I find this in. Um,
Yeah.
Zoroastrian culture has an example of, so in South Asian examples, you have the Asura and the Devas, who are the gods, and essentially, I guess you could call them like demons, but they're not. They're two sides of celestial beings. It's just one is usually interpreted now simply good and bad.
Yeah.
However, in the Zoroastrian, it's reversed, where they have the Ahura with the same gods and characters from the South Asian epic, but the good is the bad and the bad is the good. So Indra, who is seen as like a heroic god in South Asian, in the Zoroastrian was seen as evil. And it's still Indra by name. And it does make you wonder, how did these stories spread? Why are there similarities? Why do some cultures' gods reappear in other cultures even by name?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the vehicle for that? Like in this research, I discovered that Buddhism was one of the major vehicles for how a lot of South Asian culture moved to the East, because there's a famous academy, and it's the world's oldest residential university called Nalanda, where people could, from across the world, come and stay and study in South Asia. But it was a predominantly Buddhist university. So
Ah.
Buddhism became the vehicle through its spread of religion and philosophy to attract philosophers and scholars from other cultures. So
Mm-hmm.
they have records of Chinese students, Greek philosophers, Persian, and as far as Japan, who came to study, and they would trade. They would trade information, trade stories, debate philosophy, and it just created like this little mecca of intellectualism over there. And it makes me wonder how much spread back out, because Indra is worshipped and at least known in Japan by name.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's just everyone seems to kind of forget that they think now communication, like the fact that you're in America now in England and we're talking is instant. But
Yeah.
information has moved around the world, whether it's stories, mythology, or other things, for probably thousands of years at this point. And it's the vehicles of whether it's religion or whether it's travel or trade,
Right.
more likely, that's brought it around the world. And you get these constant overlaps. Like in I think it's in every single culture, there's some kind of dragon. There's some kind of dragon
Yes.
mythology.
Yes.
Like every
Yes.
single one. And you're like, why? And that's one of these things that's been bugging me at the back of my brain for years, that it's one of these things that at some point when I'm retired I'll look into. But it's one of these things that just fascinates me about
Yeah.
people and stories and sagas that we used to sing because that was the only way, because we didn't write anything
Yeah.
down.
Exactly.
So
There's actually a fascinating thing which I won't go into to take up too much time, but if you just look up the Dragon Slayer myth as a cursory example, there's similarities between so many of the earlier ones where, again, that's what Indra plays in, but a lot of earlier cultures and cradle civilization cultures had a storm or sun god who slew a dragon specifically, and in the Norse it's Thor versus Jormungandr with his lightning hammer. But Indra has a thing called Vajra, which was a proto war club imbued with all the powers of a lightning bolt that similarly, if he threw the way Thor did, it would come back to him. And he kills the demon Vitra, who's an Asura, who takes the form of a three-headed dragon and holds all the world's waters hostage. And then in the Babylonian or Sumerian, you have Marduk and Tiamat. And Tiamat is the
too much.
primordial chaos dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, again, every culture has like there's Baal and Hadad, and it's like it's usually a storm god who slays a giant, it's more often sea serpent dragon than the traditional what we have now with the winged European dragon. But
Yeah.
a lot of the earlier ones were giant tidal sea serpents. Um, but yeah, it's like we've all been telling the same story, which is actually posited in Tales of Tremaine. It's part of the arc where Ari meets a certain princess and he's discussing this, and the princess also, one of them at least, voices this theory. He's like, it sounds like a lot of all these stories around the world come from the same place, but he's kind of shy about sharing it because it seems very heretical in his culture, because he comes from a place where it's very at the time analoging somewhat Portugal. So there's a lot of religious fervor going on that's part of the plot, and
Mm.
you can't exactly be seen entertaining the idea of other religions and cultures. But he's a scholar prince, and he's like, I don't know if all our stories are really the only ones that are like this. And Ari's like, well, I'm kind of trying to figure out the original story here because he has his own motivations. Like, what spawned all of these? He's hoping to find an answer in that he needs.
Oh God, just that in itself is going to be a huge challenge. Never mind
Yeah,
the rest of the story, but that you certainly put up, an uphill battle for yourself in doing
yeah, yeah.
this.
But if it felt very fitting and hopefully rewarding in that if I make this the key themes of the story,
Mm,
it lends me the ability to play with the structure and do those storytelling things I want,
right.
which might not be as easily digestible if it weren't a story about that. But the idea justifies sort of that kind of telling, I feel like, which makes it more meta, which was the point. Like it was supposed to be as much about storytelling in any format and facet I could.
Yeah, yeah, this is it. Stories are constantly evolving, as we talked about beforehand. Genres
Mhm.
are changing, but there's commonalities between all of them, whether it's heroes and villains, gods and demigods that have existed for thousands of years at this point. Um, yeah, really fascinating stuff. So here's a question. Do you ever just want to write a straight murder mystery? Just something really simple, really kind of easy, because what you've set ahead for yourself is a massive challenge.
Believe it or not, this is a problem of mine, and part of why I also did this. I just my agent and I took a traditional crime slash thriller novel out on submission.
Right.
It's 89,000, very small book comparatively to what I wrote.
Easy.
Very straightforward structure. Um, Hopefully accessible because unfortunately, I mean not unfortunately, but it's not a very traditional white thriller, right? Like I'm writing from my background, and it's a POC thriller about an immigrant cab driver's life. Following Washington D.C. being at one point the murder and the cocaine capital of the United States.
Mm,
And there's actually real inspiration behind this of how cab drivers sometimes were forced to be drug mules by gangs because they wouldn't want to drive themselves to do things because they might be racially profiled.
mhm.
It's easier to stop them, search, and then you're caught with merchandise versus if you're in the back of a hired cab, even if you've got a gun on them behind, underneath where people could view, no one's going to really stop a cab driver unless they're breaking the law. It's not likely. And we took that out to submission. So yeah, that's my easy, straightforward,
Palate
simpler.
cleanser.
Yes, yes. It's given me a greater appreciation for that genre because I want to write more. I'm like, this is nice after a 450,000 word draft.
I can imagine. Yeah, yeah. It follows more a familiar structure. It's not like
Mhm.
not quite joining the dots, but you have to hit
Yeah.
certain beats in order to
Mhm.
serve the function of the genre that you're writing in. Did it stretch different muscles then when you were writing that compared
Yeah.
to, you know?
Absolutely. I realized I focus a lot more simply on necessarily just the beats, like you said, making sure I hit the right execution points.
Mm,
I was allowed to tone down the dialogue. Because for Tales of Tremaine, since like you brought up earlier, a lot of the epics were originally orally performed and sung.
yep.
I worked with a voice coach for years to make this as lyrical as possible through all 350,000 words. Like there was sessions of me narrating to myself, and I'm not a narrator, but trying to get a certain cadence and hearing it back and be like, I have to delete this word here. I have to say this sentence without the word the, which will piss editors off because it doesn't look grammatically correct. But if you speak it aloud, you realize it orally works and it
Mm,
sounds better. So there's entire lines that were written just by sound feel to make sure the audience, when reading this, feels like they're being performed to.
mhm.
And I could strip a lot of that away with the thriller and go to this very hard-boiled, densely packed, tight prose. Anything superfluous was gone, and it felt a lot more moving from beat point to beat point to beat point, with maybe small flourishes to allow for certain inner narration. Because it's a POV, not a lot of people will be familiar with an immigrant cab driver. I would be allowed room to explore those thoughts, then at least have a character who's aware of his different situation being an immigrant, maybe giving that information to the audience. And that would be me getting some extra words in.
Yeah, so it's first person instead of third. So
Oh no, it's
is that
third. It's just I
is
have
that
the
right?
he just has his little monologues. He's because he's hyper aware
Ah,
that once he gets in this situation, there's sort of meta commentary of he realizes he's sort of in a crime and action movie, but he's not the white character who has the same kind of agency. He's aware that he's viewed as an immigrant. He's
yep.
viewed as maybe more placid because that's something a lot of Asian Americans deal with. The idea of the model minority. You're not seen as assertive, and if you are, you're cocky. You're not confident. Um, so there's subtle things about racism that are explored, especially post 9/11 being in this case, he's a Sikh. So this is a denomination that sometimes wears a turban, the
Mhm.
beard. He endures some racism through certain slurs that I've heard, I've seen my father called, and other South Asians and Middle Easterns have been called. And it explores that in his thoughts because he can't voice them aloud because he's afraid if he does, would he get repercussions? Like would he get shot? Would he get pistol whipped? Because he's a hostage in a lot of the book, and it's
Mm.
him working his way out of that situation.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, that's out. Let's see what happens
Yeah,
with that. But
yeah.
well, yeah. When that happens, that happens. We'll see. We'll see. But book two is out imminently now, and you must. How far are you in with three? Are you planning, writing?
Yeah, I'm at the planning stage because what we did when we cut certain stuff, I wanted to make sure when I redraft the arcs for book three that I still hit everything I want. And if anything now is superfluous because of the cuts, I
Hmm.
want to at least have the room to just add it in and go, we can address this later if I feel it's still important. But there's enough set up because I don't want anything to feel rushed or crammed in. I still want the books to have room to breathe and then go, I can address this point later. And I actually begin next month. So I've got 2 more weeks left of drafting, which is perfectly fine. I think we're aiming for returning it in spring, and then that's like a year lead time, or maybe more because 2026 summer, because the books have been routinely coming out every August.
Yeah,
And after the year delay with no editor, I think they moved me to a two-year schedule, which seems yeah, like so I'm actually on track.
that's good. That's good. So, do you have any free time?
No, no, this was actually supposed to be my month off to only read and not like burn out, but I'm teaching some lecture courses with a friend of mine to help marginalized authors. So we're recording these lectures in partnership with the university,
Mhm.
and in between that, I got all the tip-ins for the special editions that just came in, and it's like, yeah,
Mm,
you've got like
broken
14 days
binding.
to charge. Yes,
Yep,
that and
busy with
I
that.
think Goldsboro, and they're like, yes, can you turn these around? They got to be back within 14 days. It's like be back within 14 days. So that includes shipping time. I'm not sure. I didn't clarify, but I'm like, okay, I'm taking the next few days just to sign morning to night, get them done. They'll be in the mail Monday. They should arrive before the worst case scenario, no matter what. Like they'll be early. That's what I'll promise. And then
Yes.
yeah. So as of now, no.
Fair. Well, that's fair. Yeah, yeah. The broken binding always do fantastic special
Yes. Oh God.
editions.
Yeah. I can't wait.
I'm looking forward to. I will go down to the warehouse and see them. So,
Oh,
uh,
that's so cool.
I'm
I
looking
love that you
forward.
can do that. Oh man.
Yeah, I'm really local to broken binding, so yeah, I'll pop down and steal some from the shelves. Um, I'll borrow a copy. I'll borrow. Yeah, borrow. Anyway. Anyway, well, thank you for coming on, and thank you for telling
Thank
me
you for having me.
about the series and everything. And I'll put links down below where everyone can find your socials and a link to Broken Binding as well to see if there's any specials editions left once they come out and the sale goes on. But you're not coming to Worldcon, though, are you? Not this year. You haven't got any time. You can't go. No time.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's also it's literally when the US release happens.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah, I and maybe I'm being, I don't know, neurotic. I just thought it'd be smart to be here to physically try to promote the book the best I can. I
yeah,
don't know if that's
definitely.
wise, but I would have loved to see in the UK, especially Scotland, but
Mm,
it is what it is.
it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. Well, it's LA next year, I think, or Seattle next year. Worldcon.
Oh, okay. I
Seattle.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it's Seattle 2026, 2025. Yeah, so that's next year. So
It's
slightly
always a
closer.
problem for me though. It's because it's the same month as Dragon Con. Dragon Con's the end of August, and I've
Mm,
always gone there. Now it's become a ritual that like my unofficial official celebration launch party for the series happens at Dragon Con every
that
year.
sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would like to go to Dragon Con. I've heard lots of good things about it. So maybe one
it's
year.
really fun. It's fun.
Um,
Just obviously different environment, less almost barely industry at all. Very much fan oriented and centric. But I found
yeah.
it very joyful to have the experience you talked about earlier. You meet a lot more of your fans there, and it feels nice to be able to at least interact with them that way and give back because they put in so much time and love supporting the series. So,
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, Ronnie, and we'll say good night and
all right,
see everyone. Good night
all
then.
right.